Hi. So this is the final part of the lecture for today, and for this part, as I mentioned in the third section at the end, I thought I'd just talk to you a little bit about the kind of elephant in the room when we're talking about globalization at the moment, and that is the current pandemic and what that means for globalization. So I've kind of hinted at areas where this is implicated throughout the lecture, but I wanted to speak about this a bit directly, just because I think it's incredibly relevant to essentially a topic for this week, and it's difficult to cover this topic at this particular time without addressing it. And maybe this is something you can talk a bit more about in the tutorials as well, unless your tutors have a whole host of lots of other things planned for you. So to start off with, I think the current pandemic is interesting because in many ways the spread of it, the fact that it is a pandemic, was caused by globalization. So it started off in the Wuhan in China, Hubei province, and began to spread there. But then, after a period of time, we start to see cases emerge in other countries, and that's facilitated obviously by air travel for the most part, by the movement of people, which is one of the really significant aspects of globalization, the increased movement of people across the globe. And so even by February, we start to see measures put into place to try to halt the spread of this virus. So quite a notable one was the Australian government closing the transport of commercial passengers between China and Australia, which had quite dire implications for a lot of people who were planning to come to Australia for their tertiary studies if they weren't already in the country. And that also made the Chinese government quite angry at Australia at that particular point in time. They saw it as an overreaction. So essentially, we start to see a kind of closing of this global openness that we've discussed. And so essentially, the pandemic its spread is facilitated by globalization, is facilitated by these transport technologies that David Harvey focused on, which, compress time and space, which make our world very small in a lot of ways. And so the immediate kind of response to this is to halt some aspects of globalization, to stop the movement of people, especially. But this is particularly something that's been very challenging because of the interconnected nature of our world. So you could see that there was political backlash at first about closing borders, especially the kind of Australian border to China in that sense. And there was also complications about closing national borders. So for the EU countries, that wasn't actually a decision that was purely up to those particular states. That was a decision that had to go to the EU. So those kind of layers of authority, it takes additional time, and there's additional permission that's needed. So being part of a regional kind of economic bloc in that case may have delayed that process. And in addition to that, the incredible openness of the borders of the EU countries in many ways allowed for a very free movement of people, and perhaps allowed the virus to spread more than it would in a very closed world. We also see some of the complexities that come about as part of living in a globalized world. So we see the difficulties, ongoing difficulties, trying to return citizens living overseas. So the repatriation of Australian citizens, especially in cases where they're overseas for a long time. They have been living in another country for a long time. They perhaps have a partner who's not an Australian citizen. And we equally see challenges of overseas citizens who are currently in Australia or were in Australia at the start of this pandemic. There's questions about whether to stay or to go, and then there's government guidelines on those types of questions. And we can see at this point, for those who have not returned to Australia or returned to the country in which they're a citizen, it's becoming increasingly difficult to do so because of the kind of shutdown of a lot of commercial flights, and the question of whether it might be necessary to charter planes starting to come onto the table. So this, I think, this really emphasizes like this kind of shutting down and this return to the relevance of citizenship. It really emphasizes the importance of these types of legal statuses. We also have the types of solutions that states have put forward. So, if we take Australia as an example that's very close to home and familiar to all of us, we can see. So, obviously, the pandemic is an incredibly difficult situation because, as Scott Morrison keeps telling us, it's both an economic crisis and a health crisis. It's probably primarily a health crisis and will be an economic crisis in times to come, and is in a very personal way for many who have lost their jobs. And so the solutions to this, which are fantastic in so many ways, the rescue packages, the economic solutions, especially around job seeker and job keeper funding, and the funding that's being provided to various like businesses and such, and relief coming from banks to mortgage holders, and hopefully then passed on to renters. And we can see all of that, but I think it's very important to keep in mind that these particular measures are only for citizens and I believe permanent residents. So they're very much limited to those individuals who have like a certain legal status within this country. So they're not at all offered to people who, for instance, are refugees. And so I know the Asylum Seeker Resource Centre in Melbourne, which does a lot of really fantastic work. Centrelink has been directing people who are not eligible for these payments to the Asylum Seeker Resource Centre because there's just nowhere else to send them at this point. Having the right to work in Australia doesn't really mean much if there's literally no work and there are no jobs. We can also see some of the issues that we're contending with around especially our global chains of manufacturing. So this is going back to what I spoke to you about, the kind of new global division of labour, new economic division of labour, in which increasingly manufacturing occurs offshore in what were called peripheral countries by Emmanuel Wallerstein and his world systems theory. So we know, for instance, that an enormous amount of the medicine that we rely on is manufactured in China and some in India as well. So we know the face masks that our medical professionals, our frontline workers really need at the moment. I think for the US, about 90% again of the face masks that they were previously purchasing actually came from Hubei province in China, which is probably not really somewhere that's going to be shipping those to the rest of the world at present. They're most likely going to be using their own domestic supply. And so we encounter these supply chain issues, and the solution to that in many cases has been for states to be increasingly manufacturing these products themselves. So we have a rum distillery in Australia that started making hand sanitizer. We have some kind of factory that's suddenly producing these masks. So we have this incredible surge in the domestic production of these types of products. And we have, instead of an international division of labour, we instead are looking more inward. We're looking at a domestic kind of production system. And so all of this sounds very kind of inward looking, and especially, very inward looking amongst the kind of countries that each country is very focused on themselves and their own citizens, which is understandable. But one kind of divergence from this, or one reassuring thing, I suppose, was the meeting on the 26th of March of the G20 leaders, the 20 largest economies in the world. And the leaders of these states have pledged to cooperate in order to address the kind of health, economic, and trade implications of the pandemic. But I think it's really important to keep in mind that these types of pledges are non-binding, and in the weeks and months to come, we can we can look at what our turn away from globalization might mean for countries that have less resources than than Australia, than the United States, than the UK. That's one thing to really keep our eye on. And I think perhaps another particularly troubling thing, if we look to what's happening now, our response to the health element of this pandemic, which is of course something incredibly huge and concerning, has been to shut down global interconnectedness, to turn towards domestic manufacturing, to turn towards a very protectionist stance. So, we're in a situation at present in which it's illegal to send any kind of medical supplies out of Australia, and you will cop a huge fine for doing so, and the supplies will be seized and put into our national stockpiles. So that's a very kind of forceful representation of the prioritization of Australian citizens by the national government. And these types of approaches, it's of course in some ways necessary to address the health implications of the pandemic, but then if we look to history to look at what the economic recovery might look like, we have a bit of a cautionary tale about continuing this economic protectionism. So we can turn our minds back to the Great Depression, beginning in 1929 and spanning into the 1930s. So in the year 1930, the US put in place a range of trade tariffs, which is essentially economic penalties on imported products, which must be paid by the people that were trying to import products into the US. So that essentially is an incentive to not try to import products and to instead buy American-made products. And the idea behind that was very clearly to try and stimulate and restart the US economy, but that did not work very well. And the US and the rest of the world really the rest of the world followed suit and also put up some tariffs. And the recovery only really got into full swing when all of those trade barriers were dismantled. And the kind of post tail end of the Great Depression is where a lot of our free trade agreements originated from. So, or where their kind of predecessor agreements originated from. So really, we have a particularly interesting cautionary tale that the solution to one element of this crisis, the health element, may not be a particularly good solution to the economic element. And then I think as well, we can wait and see what the humanitarian implications of this particular pandemic, this crisis, are going to be. Especially, we have people who do not really have freedom of movement in refugee camps, for instance, that are uniquely vulnerable. So that's another particularly pertinent element of globalization for us to be thinking about. We can be thinking about those who have moved out of necessity or been forcibly moved, and what might happen to them when we close down all of our kind of global movement of people, our globalization of people. And so these are some of the considerations around globalization and the pandemic. So hopefully that gives you some food for thought. I would be really interested if you come across any resources that are particularly interesting on this topic. Please feel free to send them to me. I'd love to have a read. And I also really recommend, if you're looking for some interesting commentary to read on this current situation, if you're not completely overwhelmed by information and wanting to just distract yourself, then Steve put up a really fantastic link to some pandemic related resources from some good quality news sources and good quality academic sociological style commentary. So that's definitely something to consider if you're interested. I think there's a link in the announcement from last week or the week before, so just scroll down on the announcement page. So I'll leave it there for today. Thanks for sticking with me, and I hope that you're all safe and well and that your families are well, and I hope that you have the best possible Easter under the current conditions. If your supermarket's anything like mine, your toilet paper aisle is full of chocolate, and perhaps we can all take advantage of that. So, goodbye, and I'll see you for the week 8 lecture on the other side of the break.